fraudsters' full-time job is doing it. It's not like a little side hustle they have on the night time between 6 and 9 p.m., then you could look at how you would take advantage of that. So the consequences or the regulations that are put in place have consequences which are about intended to protect and, provide cover and clarity.
You're listening to Behind Enemy Lines. In each episode, we'll explore advanced fraud fighting strategies with experts battling financial crime every day. Discover what it takes to stay one step ahead of the most sophisticated fraudsters. Ready to sharpen your defenses? Let's get started.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Behind Enemy Lines. I'm Mike LaFleur, and this episode is brought to you by ThreatMark, your ally in the war against fraud. Today our guest is Chris Oakley, Director of Fraud Intelligence at ThreatMark. Chris, thanks for joining me today.
Great to be here, Mike. Really looking forward to the conversation.
It's really interesting to me, Chris, that when we were talking, getting ready for the podcast, I had really no idea that you were going to join ThreatMark. We were talking about bringing you on as a subject matter expert, and we were going to have this conversation that we're going to have today. But since that conversation and now you've actually joined ThreatMark, I'd like you to talk about what you're going to be doing at ThreatMark. Before we get to that, I always ask all the guests how they got from where they were to where they are now. So, for my story goes from back when I was in high school until where I'm at now. You can choose to go back as far as you want, but how did you get from not fighting fraud to fighting fraud?
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting one, actually. So my background has always been around data analytics and insight. And I kind of cut my teeth, so to speak, in the UK banking system across a number of institutions, from the likes of NatWest Group, the Co-op Bank. And then I was given the opportunity to move to Virgin Money. That was a kind of a challenger bank in the UK. And that was an opportunity that was given to me to utilize those analytical skills that I had, but then to apply them into the subject area of financial crime across both fraud and anti-money laundering from a strategy and an analytics and a systems perspective. And I guess that's how I got into fraud, is I moved from utilizing data and analytics in general retail banking into utilizing it in fraud. And then from there, I've just kind of, evolved through roles and skills and experiences, both within the banks. So Virgin Money, HSBC, obviously looking at things from a global perspective in terms of our strategic fraud requirements, but also in the tech sector. So, working at Featurespace as a subject matter expert, working at Form 3, the payments processing arm, that is providing connectivity for banks, but also looking at fraud propositions there. So, my kind of experience has been moving from the banks into the tech sector to look at how banks can be better served and financial institutions can be better served in fighting fraud. And I guess that's what brought me to ThreatMark, which is, the opportunity that ThreatMark is really building something super exciting by looking at kind of fraud intelligence. So in its simplistic terms, my role here at ThreatMark is about really championing the use of sharing data, collaborating on intelligence, and actually looking at how collectively we can fight the fraud. Rather than being individual banks or people doing it, collectively we can work together to create a much better environment and ecosystem to be able to protect the end customers from being victims of fraud.
That's super interesting. Yeah, I have to admit, right before we got ready to record, I was listening to an episode that we recorded just a little while ago. And the guy that I was talking to offers red team services to financial institutions. So, for testing purposes. And I asked him for advice, what piece of advice he would give financial institutions. And one of the pieces of advice that he gave was, you really need to start looking at threat intelligence from a fraud perspective and not just threat intelligence from a cybersecurity perspective. So that's what you're up to at ThreatMark now, is setting up an intelligence apparatus, as it were.
Yeah, absolutely. It's about bringing, our customers, our partners on a journey to help everyone out and, one of the things that really appealed to me about ThreatMark is the kind of the social and moral responsibility that we have as a market leading vendor in this space to actually make a difference. So actually the excitement to be part of that and to look at how we can take, cutting edge technology, the regulations that are coming down the line across a number of different markets, as well as protecting our customers on that journey, is just a really, really exciting place to be.
Yeah, I totally agree. The passion that the people that I work with at ThreatMark every day is one of the reasons that, just makes the job important, makes it interesting, and makes it, one that I'm likely going to stick around for or stick around with for quite a long time. And, the podcast is essentially the outcome of all of that. We try to do the podcast just to have conversations about fraud and fraud fighting in general in the context of, trying to help protect treasure of people who have entrusted financial institutions with that treasure. You just said a word that we originally, before I knew you were coming to ThreatMark, we had said this was going to be what we were going to be talking about on the podcast. So you said the word regulation and regulatory environment, and I think that's where we want to focus our talk today. So I know from previous conversations with you that one of the areas you focus on is fraud regulation specifically. And I guess I'd be interested in getting your take from, a really high level, a really macro level. How do you see these regulations that exist or that are coming about? What's sort of the state of the regulatory environment across the globe right now from your perspective?
Yeah, and I'm just going to be a little controversial to start off with, Mike. I think that when we're talking about regulation in the fraud space, it typically means that as an industry, we haven't done a good enough job. So regulation in the fraud industry happens because consumers are still becoming victims of fraud. Banks are not placing the customer at the heart of their decisions. There's financial, mental, physical, psychological impacts that are massive in this space. And I think that's the really key thing for me. If I look back a little bit over kind of the regulational journey that we've been on around fraud, almost all of it is because the banks haven't done enough. And I think the really interesting thing is then, in terms of if you just have a little bit of a glass eye forward, is actually, are the next regulations that are going to come in the fraud space happening because that's all happening again and we're not doing enough to protect our consumers? Or are they actually driving the right outcomes and the right behaviors? So let's just take a couple of examples in that space. So in the UK, there's a couple of key bits of regulation that have happened recently. So in the UK, you had PSD2, the Payment Systems Directive 2, the regulation that came in, and that mandated that there was a need for consumers to have to go through what we called SCA, or strong customer authentication, when they're completing a online payment. Why did that happen? Well, that happened because there was a big increase in fraud that was taking place in what we call the unauthorized channels. So people having people's card details fraudulently, and the banks weren't doing enough to be able to do it. So rather than proactively finding ways to do it, it was mandated by the industry that this needed to happen. What happened as a result of it? Well, actually, the fraud rates have come down. And the fraud rates come down because it's been mandated that it's had to happen. But it's created some really strong pain points along the way for customers who don't understand, why am I being asked to do this? So the regulation, when it's enforced on things, tends to come with a bit of a negative approach to it. And actually what you tend to see is people look at it as a tick box exercise to complete it. Actually, what I'd love to see is regulation being seen as opportunity rather than a tick box. So we're having to do something different because of regulation. How do we actually really re-engineer what we do? How do we actually improve what we have to do because of it? So in the banks, something like 90% of funding around change programs goes into regulatory or mandatory change programs. So if you want to do something in a bank that is, and that's appreciate that's a big generalization, but as a rough principle, but if you want to do something and you've only got 10% of your budget to be able to work with, getting a slice of that 10% is quite difficult. But if you've got the 90% to go at, actually being able to make the right decisions and the right outcomes of regulation is really, really quite crucial. So, and then if you look at the next bit of regulation in the UK, which came in October of 2024, which is around the mandatory reimbursement of victims of scams and the split liability. Why did it happen? Because the banks weren't refunding consumers in the UK around it consistently. And therefore, because it wasn't being done consistently, they've adopted this principle of mandating and forcing regulation onto the banks. So I think for me, the regulation should be seen as opportunity rather than negative. But actually, we also need to look across the globe and see about, well, what works and what doesn't work. Because what we see is there's big inconsistencies right from neighboring countries in terms of what you are and you aren't kind of protected for and where regulation kind of takes you.
Yeah, makes sense. You said something really interesting about the customer experience, and with PSD2, with strong customer authentication being put in place, and the customers not really understanding why their banking experience had just sort of degraded because now they have to jump through hoops or go through a lot of friction to get access to their accounts. And this idea of the reimbursement of the fraud losses, these are opportunities for banks to put that customer back into the center too. You could look at those regulations and say, yeah, we want to protect those accounts, and we must use SCA to do it. But what if there was a way to do SCA so that it was transparent to the user? So they get the increased security, but they don't have the friction that the typical approaches to SCA are, or even the reimbursement of the money. They don't feel like they have to fight to get their treasure back. You could look at these regulations as ways of putting the customer back into the center of the decision-making process.
Yeah, and I think, a customer experience or user experience should be at the center of kind of how this stuff does get looked at. It's often said, and, one of the things that I found really helpful for me in terms of running, fraud teams and looking at fraud is hearing firsthand the challenges and the experience that consumers have gone through. Because it's only when you experience something in the shoes of those that you are trying to support that you can actually understand where something is going wrong. There's a lot of work that takes place about looking at, other parts of a journey. If you're applying for a new product, the banks will naturally want to make that as seamless as possible to be able to do it, to encourage people to do it. And therefore, the customer experience and how easy it is for you to navigate through the screens and all those things is absolutely focused in. But back to my point before, when it's regulation and it's, well, I have to do it, therefore, it's not necessarily considered about how you do it in the best way. So if you think about the regulations around SCA, you've got to have 2 out of the 3 factors: something I know, something I am, something that I own. And actually, you can do that with technology without actually having to necessarily interfere in the customer journey as much. But actually, the vast majority of organizations, certainly when this went live, focused on the old one-time password via a text message coming in. So actually at that point, because that met one of the requirements to do it, but it meant that you had to get the text message, it meant you had to then put it into a web browser, a mobile app. And therefore the regulation meant that it was being done as a tick box, because it was just there to say, well, I've done that. Whereas actually you could do it a lot better. So this is my real kind of key driver, which is regulation should be a stimulus for change. It should be a stimulus for an improvement, not just a case of saying, I've now met the regulation, because it gives you the opportunity to stand out in a crowded space from what everyone else is doing along the way. If we look at some of the neobanks and the startups and the challenger banks that have been built on an agile stack and all that stuff, they have come up with really, really clever ways that differentiates on a technology basis around how to comply with regulation and create a better experience. Yeah.
I mean, that's their competitive advantage. That's what they see as one of their competitive advantages, that experience. So you mentioned this thing about the tick box or the attitude that I'm going to tick the box, therefore I've complied. And, it seems to me both the regulation and the compliance with the regulation are sort of reactionary. There was something that happened that gave impetus to the regulation, then based on the regulation, you comply with the regulation. So those are both reactionary. In your experience globally, is there anywhere where it seems like the regulations are not in reaction, they're actually a proactive effort to stem fraud before it becomes a huge problem? Are there any places you can think of?
Well, I think the really exciting space around this is in some of the APAC regions. So countries like Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia. And, with those countries, what they are kind of really driving is a culture of communication and engagement across all areas of the chain, in essence. So that's from a financial institution perspective. It's from a police enforcement perspective. It's from a telco perspective. It's from a social media perspective. It's from the police. It's all working together. And actually, a lot of these are now have kind of co-located hubs that allow access to be able to work collectively on these things. So it's not mandated, or certainly wasn't when it started, mandated that you have to do these things. But the industry in those countries have really proactively said, well, to make a difference, we have to work together. And it's not just, Bank A and Bank B and Bank C working together. It's everyone working together in the chain, because it's such a complex space, particularly in the authorized fraud space now around payments. It's such a challenging space in terms of, how this has happened in the first place. And actually almost the banks are the last line of it. But actually, if you've been a victim of a scam, you've already been scammed by the time that you're looking to make that payment. So actually, it's further up the chain that there's the ability to work kind of in partnership. So that's really interesting in APAC. And actually, what you see is a little bit as an interesting model in Australia. So Australia has recently going through a lot of significant regulation that's being driven down, but uniquely it is mandating the role of social media and telcos in terms of reliability and a response perspective for frauds. And actually, some data that came out, earlier this month in we're recording this in March 2025. The data out there this month shows that there has been quite a significant drop in scam volumes in Australia over the last 12 months as a result of, or you can attribute it to, a greater responsibility being put onto the wider ecosystem to play their part rather than just the individual banks. So there's two real clear examples there, one of which is proactive, get ahead of the game, really work together collectively to make a difference. And the other is actually regulation coming in to enforce the end protection of the consumer rather than a mandate about what you should be doing at the final stage of that process.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Do you see these models, both the teamwork model and then the Australian model? Do you see that across the globe? I'm not really asking, is it right now, but could it?
I think it will depend on the extent to which regulation is actually enforced and encouragement is made to collaborate on this information. So there's a lot of the reason why this doesn't happen is people hide behind that lovely 4-letter acronym of GDPR. Okay. And actually I was at an event last year and I was talking about the challenges around data sharing. And actually my observation was, well, actually, if we didn't call it GDPR, which was the data protection regulations, which in essence is why you don't do it, and we called it the DSR, the data sharing regulations, so the influence is a yes rather than a no, and that came in when GDPR came in, we would be in a significantly better place because people's mindsets would be about sharing rather than protecting. Because fraud is a legitimate reason to be able to share data for the purposes of, fraud identification and fraud disruption. So actually, do I think it will go to other markets? Absolutely, I think it will do, because I think it will be seen that it works and it makes a difference. I think the challenge will come is that the number of different parties that have to take place in this if they're not willing and engaged to come on board with it, they're regulated by different people, they're controlled by different people. So it's very difficult to make them come together to be able to do it. But if they all have the appetite to make a difference and, see it's their corporate and their social responsibility to make a difference, then I think it can make a real difference, and it can be deployed not only in a single country basis, but I think on a global basis, because the real challenge is fraud across borders. Because just because something, if I use my example of Singapore and the work that Singapore's doing, if it goes from Singapore to Malaysia and there's no connectivity in place between Singapore and Malaysia to be able to do that, then immediately that problem just rises up again in a different space. So we've got a long way to go, but it's down to the attitude, desire and commitment of everyone to actually think about the end customers and protecting that, to be able to find a way to be able to do this. And that's where I think it's really interesting, companies like ThreatMark are doing, about finding ways to look at how you can share this intelligence and you can collaborate accordingly on it.
Yeah. You mentioned a phrase that I think people tiptoe around sometimes, and it's social responsibility in terms of fraud. I know in my personal life, when people find out what I do for work, they'll give me all sorts of examples about people who have been victims of fraud. And, and there's this implication, people say, well, I'm glad you're doing that because grandma had this happen to her or something like that. So, I think everybody, if they were really pressed, they would see that there is a social responsibility to fight this fraud. And if that's the case, then they probably should be more willing to work together and, for across disciplines to make this happen.
Yeah, I think Mike, on that, I'd agree with you. I think, it really should be a motivation and a driver. I guess my plea to, the industry that I work alongside and with and in is, just because something seems okay, don't accept that it's good enough. Constantly be looking about, should we be doing more? It's a really difficult one, because in a commercial decision-making environment, you are looking at, how do I maximize the value I make as a company for my shareholders, for my investors? And you're trying to maximize that, and you are balancing that out versus, do I spend this extra million as in terms of dividend payments back, or do I invest this £1 million in updating system A and B to be able to create more effective? And I absolutely understand it's a fine balance. I guess my ask is that as an industry, we really need to challenge ourselves to make sure, are we doing enough? And we need to look at ourselves and go, have we done enough?
Right. I want to go back to the regulation and the evolution of regulations. When we talked before, you brought up something that I had never thought about before. And that was that new regulations, even regulations that are designed to help stop fraud, actually create new opportunities for fraud. What's your thought on that?
I think it's really interesting. So I think there's a couple of different angles to that, Mike. The first is, absolutely, regulation around fraud creates intended and unintended consequences. So let's just take an example. Let's take about in the UK, where we've implemented the mandated reimbursement angle. So the intended consequences of that is to ensure that no consumer, no victim is financially impacted as a result of it. Okay, so that's the intended consequence. The unintended consequence is, how do I play that system? And I'm not going to go on this podcast behind enemy lines and say, well, you could do this, this, and this, and then you could get around the system. Yeah. But if we think about it for a minute, there's ambiguity around what gross negligence means within this space. There are exceptions in place if you are a vulnerable customer. There are a number of different caveats that could take place. And the vulnerable customer one is really interesting. In the UK, according to the definitions that are set out by the regulatory bodies, in the UK, I think it's about 53% of people in the UK could be deemed as vulnerable. So that's over 50% of the population is theoretically open to some degree of exemption associated with this. So in that situation, if you were thinking smart about this as a fraudster, and let's remember that our full-time job is stopping this stuff. Fraudster's full-time job is doing it. It's not like a little side hustle they have on the night time between 6 and 9 p.m., then you could look at how you would take advantage of that. So the consequences or the regulations that are put in place have consequences which are intended to protect and, provide cover and clarity. Actually, what they also do is they provide opportunities for the fraudsters. So one of the areas that I think is very interesting to keep an eye on is almost kind of first-party fraud collusion in this mandated reimbursement space. So if we just unpack that for a minute. So if I have been a victim of a scam, then my bank will reimburse me that money. And that money will have gone to the money mule. So at that point, the money mule has my, let's just use example numbers, £10,000. I am 10,000 out of pocket, but I've been reimbursed that 10,000. So at this point, I have 10,000 and the money mule has 10,000. But if I'm actually in collusion with that money mule, then in that situation, basically what we have done is we've created a fraudulent claim against the industry that's resulted in us getting £10,000, as well as the ability to then facilitate that money movement onwards as part of the wider process of the proceeds of crime. Now, a lot of what banks are doing is about trying to spot and identify, but it's that intended and unintended consequences that always scares me about regulation. So I come back to my point from the beginning. If you are having regulation enforced on you, it's too late, because actually what you're doing is not doing enough. If you can proactively mitigate this risk by finding the ways to work together to develop the right technology solutions, to really almost take the narrative around where we're going and why from a fraud and security perspective, then actually what you're not doing is creating ambiguity because there's words that are written down on a piece of paper that two people can disagree on in terms of how you apply that.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So it makes it more complex than just, if the concept is we're just stopping fraud or we're just proactively protecting our customers, this makes it extremely complex. It's got to be a challenging set of obstacles for a financial institution to both provide good service, to provide the protection, and then comply with these regulations. Meanwhile, looking for other opportunities for fraud that open up because of those regulations. It's really a complicated situation.
It really is, and I think one of the real challenges that a bank I think faces in this space is about who's responsible for what. Okay, so if you consider, let's say if you take out a mortgage, it doesn't matter where you are in the world, if you take out a mortgage, you are borrowing some money, you're paying interest on that money, and the interest that you pay on that money to the bank is not only covering the cost of the bank providing you with those funds, but it's providing revenue, but it's also providing protection against potential expected loss on that mortgage. And we're not saying that any singular mortgage would go wrong, but collectively it's a portfolio spread to provide cover against bad debt or repossessions having to take place. Let's not do a history lesson of kind of the 08-09 financial crisis, but that clearly shows where that went wrong. Now, in that situation, the credit losses that you take on a mortgage are just deemed as part of doing business. So they're a cost of business. Now, is fraud a cost of doing business, or is fraud a consumer experience issue? Well, I would argue it's a consumer experience issue that has to be funded by the revenue associated from a product. But they are entirely different to what would happen in terms of credit loss on a mortgage. And actually, that was that question mark about who is responsible for it, and that convergence between a risk lens, but also a customer lens and a commercial lens. They have to really work together, because actually fraud at any point in time is in a state of kind of equilibrium or balance. And there's three factors in it, which is how much disruption to my customers, how much do I want to lose, and how many people do I need to be able to manage this process within my bank? So at any point, if you move any of those, it will have an impact somewhere else because they're in equilibrium. And as soon as you unbalance the equilibrium, it pops up somewhere else. So the importance of having joined up approaches and conversations between your operations leader, so be that your chief operations officer or your operations director, your chief customer officer or your customer experience teams from a how much do I want to get in the way of my customer, and my CFO or my chief risk officer or my money laundering risk officer from how much money am I prepared to lose on fraud and what's my risk appetite. All of those three functions have to properly engage with each other, because otherwise you get decisions taken in silo, and when it's a silo, it will impact the other parts of it that are not in that silo without being understood.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And then once you get it into equilibrium and things are running really smoothly and really well, a new regulation comes into effect and it upsets the equilibrium a little bit.
Absolutely. And a lot of that then comes about readiness. Yeah. So if regulation is coming, have you done that impact assessment? Have you done the modeling? Have you done the analysis to say, well, actually in this situation, let's just take, SCA coming in for stepping up payments or stepping up card transactions, doesn't matter where, have we done it to say, well, what is that actually going to look like? Or if you look at something like confirmation of payee or the forthcoming verification of payee regulations in Europe, that it's about 16% of all confirmation of payee, all payments in the UK will have a confirmation of payee check. So have you done that and impacted assessed that and understood what that really means in terms of how many times a customer setting up new payees? Therefore, what does it mean? How do we educate? How do we communicate that? Have you done that appropriate research on it? Because it comes back to that full circle of what's the customer experience on that? Because as you say, any change in those kind of things will create a disbalance. So if you take that example again, customers have got to go through step-up authentication. Okay, so I'm increasing my customer friction that's taking place along the way. What will that do? That's probably going to drive an increase in the calls into my contact center or my communications channels. So I'm going to need more people to be able to deal with web chat, calls, emails, whatever it might be, potential disputes about why am I doing this? But as a benefit of that, my fraud losses are going to come down. So actually by doing it, I'm increasing two things, which is my customer friction and my operational needs, but I am improving my fraud losses. Is that the right outcome? That's down to each bank's individual risk appetite, but it has to be considered in the round.
Yeah. So if you were going to turn that into a piece of advice, and by the way, we're pushing up against the time, so I'm just going to do a little transition. You just listed a bunch of questions that someone should ask, and you just listed implications of changes that are made. If you were going to turn that into a piece of advice for a financial institution in the context of our entire conversation, what advice would you have?
I think it's simple. And I don't mean that to sound patronizing, but I think it's about, you have to imagine yourself in your customer's shoes. You have to ask yourself, is what we're doing enough? If I was the customer, my parent, my grandparent, my son or daughter was the customer. And then the follow-up to that is, okay, it's enough, but could I do more? And how do I have that responsibility to be able to do more? Because what we said at the start about regulations being tick box and enforced and therefore predominantly negative outcomes, taking control of our own destiny in this space enables better outcomes for everyone. There is stuff that is on track. So, the PSD3 regulations that are coming in, we haven't as yet touched on the US. So perhaps that's another conversation we can have at some point, Mike. But, those kind of regulations are happening, but that ability to proactively embrace them and make the right decisions and the right outcomes, that's important. So I guess really simply, my advice is think about what this means for your customers. Think about how you can do more and be prepared to be a part, an active part in solving the problems of today and the future. Don't expect it to be solved for you. You have to come to the table and be a part of it. And if we work together on these things, that's when we can really make a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are, like I said, winding down, and I think this is a good transition point. You just said we have to work together. I'm going to give you the opportunity to talk a little bit about what you're trying to implement at ThreatMark right now, if you don't mind.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thanks. And I think, what we're trying to do at ThreatMark at the minute, from my perspective around the fraud intelligence side of things is really two things. It's about how can we evolve and develop our ability to provide intelligence back to banks around the risk associated with accounts that they may be paying to, with individual transactions that are being made. And that's being done by looking at more than just a single bank's view. It's about looking at multiple banks together to be able to gain a greater ecosystem view of risk. And that's really important. But equally alongside that is the security aspect of it. So a lot of banks are very nervous, back to my GDPR comment earlier, around their obligations and their responsibilities about it. So we've employed, kind of absolute best in class and even stronger security protocols around tokenization and encryption to ensure that we mitigate those risks and actually create a solution that is value adding. So that's the really basic bit of what we do, Mike. But I guess the really exciting bit is actually there's so much more that we can do. So there's the ability for us to be able to share information actively between participants who are open to doing that, to give greater insight about money mules, to give greater explainability around the reasons why things are happening. And all of those things are super, super exciting. And there's a really clear way that we can do it. And we're really looking forward to working with our existing customers, but also new customers, to be an active part of this kind of revolution about how we move that forward.
Yeah. And it's all about working together to fight the fraud.
Yeah, I mean, ThreatMark's whole thing is we are fraud fighters, and we are disrupting. We are disruptors in what we do. Actually, what we want to do with this particular project, which is really important, is about making everyone fraud fighters. Everyone's got a role to play together. And actually, if we are a community of fraud fighters, not just a tech company that's doing it, but we are a community across technology, financial institutions, potentially social media and others, then the impact that we have is so much greater.
That's it. Exactly. So if someone wanted to talk to you more about what you're up to, how would they contact you?
And the best thing to do is to go onto our website, which is threatmark.com. And there's the opportunity to get in touch with us there. And you'll be able to send details through, and we'll be able to get in touch with you and talk to you more about what we're doing.
Terrific. Well, Chris, thanks for joining us. I really appreciate you spending this time with me. Fascinating stuff. Your insight is powerful. Your recommendations, I think, are spot on. And it was great having you on Behind Enemy Lines.
Thanks, Mike. It's been great, and look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Behind Enemy Lines. Be sure to subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts so you never miss a conversation on fighting fraud. We'll see you on the next one.